Alright, so where we left off, we were talking about authenticity and problematizing our notion of authenticity as this one-way process between a host country and the US. So, as we left off, when we look at the Mole's piece on Thai restaurant, we can begin to understand authenticity as this complex two-way process, as opposed to this one-way display your true culture to us sort of idea that we have. So, if we look at Shibuya's piece on lowriders, on page 175, he discusses the construction of authenticity not just as a Western form, but as a hegemonic norm that only allows for certain kinds of representations, and through this complex process of regulation based on media images and what we believe to be authentic. So this then relates over to Sunaina Meyer's piece. On page 226, she talks about the representation of tradition. Not of tradition as this evident thing, but as tradition as a thing that's always recreated and reconstructed, repackaged, and as Pham and Ono say, re-represented to different audiences. So instead of then getting angry that it's not authentic, we should ask ourselves, to what purpose is authenticity being put, and to whose benefit? So then, instead of looking only at authenticity, we're also then thinking about what producers want, what consumers want, how that participates in specific modes of cultural regulation, and how this then dialogues to our real-world understanding of the people that are being represented. Meyer's piece also raises an interesting question of what happens when we like people's cultures more than we like actual people. If we're looking at the difference between our fascination with South Asian cultures, which can also relate to our fascination by, for example, Indian weddings and Indian wedding traditions, as well as yoga, we can ask ourselves why we have this particular fascination with these types of practices and products. On page 231, she talks about the process of cultural appropriation, taking from a different culture. Not necessarily always in the mode of transculturation, having an honest moment of cultural sharing, but instead more like a cultural stealing, specifically for profit, and taking it away from the people who participate in it. This also relates to, on page 235, she begins to talk about digestibility. We take from different cultures to help us digest different identities and differences, but not always in relation to the actual people that these cultures are produced by and refer to. So, what I want us to think about is how the use of other cultures helps us ideologically to digest something else. We've already talked about how, bottom line, someone's making a profit, but we also need to think about these ideological meanings that come along with it. Not everything will make a profit. So it's important to think about those specific ideological influences that make something cultural marketable, as well as who's benefiting from it and towards what end. In Campbell's piece, on page 224, he talks about globalization. So his piece is talking about this complex combination of local conditions and global culture. So globalization is part globalization, but also part local. So here we're paying less attention to culture being produced somewhere else, and paying more attention to the people who produce it, right? So whereas Sunaina Meyer's piece on Mendis, Bindis, and Henna talk about how culture is imported without the people, instead we're thinking about people organically producing a form of culture that is uniquely, in this case, US-Mexico border, but at the same time doesn't exist elsewhere, it exists here. So, by complicating authenticity, we then come to this dynamic between agency and accountability. On the one hand, agency is a central issue because it is the ability of everyday people to make choices. And so, for example, if we're looking at Thai restaurants and how they package authentic Thai experience according to the consumer's expectations, we're left with this question of why would people do that? So, I also want us to think about accountability in a different way. As we talked about in relation to TV, accountability is an issue because there are these producers who are creating images without having any knowledge of the images that they're producing and the sorts of social ramifications, real-world ramifications outside of the realm of culture that it may have. So we can understand authenticity as a necessary evil. On the one hand, authenticity encapsulates our hopes and wishes for something to be informed and to have a sort of cultural accountability behind it. So in that way it's necessary, but we can also challenge the specific construction of authenticity. There is no absolute truth to what is authentic culture, but we can ask ourselves under what conditions are we consuming this culture, which then leads us to these complicated questions about our own complicity in this process of Orientalism and tropicalization. Plus, if we think about authenticity as a necessary evil, we also have to ask ourselves about what happens when identity becomes constructed through appropriated images, not just from the outside, but from the inside as well. So in Sunayana Myra's piece, we then get these terms: second-order Orientalism, relational Orientalism, and peripheral Orientalism. So I'll ask you questions about these on the discussion board, but we can also think about this in relation to tropicalization: second-order tropicalization, relational tropicalization, and peripheral tropicalization. Here we're thinking about racial meanings as always being in dialogue with something else. They don't just happen just to, on the one hand, Asian Pacific Americans, or just to US Latinas and Latinos, but always happen in relation to these other racial categories and racial meanings that we have out there. Plus, I want us to question what we mean when we actually talk about culture. Because when I'm talking about culture here, I'm talking about nationalized modes of meaning making that we understand as belonging to a different country. But I want us to be very critical of the difference between culture, identity, and community. Identity as referring to people, not in this way, but also referring to the identities that we have. And we can understand community as, on the one hand, a real collection of people, right? People who live together constitute a community, or people who relate to one another in the real world constitute a community. But we can also understand community as an imagined form. So for example, if we talk about ethnicity, oftentimes we don't know everyone who belongs to our ethnic background, but we do think of ourselves as a community in that way. And this is not just like an Asian Pacific American thing or a US Latino thing, but as referring to the concept as a whole of an imagined community. So we then see that there's a difference between, on the one hand, culture as this discrete process of meaning making, identity as referring to a specific person or specific people who may or may not have a relationship to what we call a culture, and community as a real collection of people or an imagined collection of people. People with an identity don't always belong to a community and don't always belong to a culture. This becomes very important because that way we avoid the sorts of flattening that take place in designating cultural otherness. Part of Orientalism and part of tropicalization always assume that, on the one hand, Asian Pacific Americans, and on the other hand, US Latinas and Latinos are always stuck in the past, always stuck in tradition, or always stuck in their own culture. It's really important to understand and make a space, not just for hybridity and transculturation, but also for cultural change and cultural newness that can't be anticipated, and also just understanding these people as also being American. I mean, there are millions of Asian Pacific Americans who are US born and firmly a part of US culture. There are also millions of US Latinas and Latinos who, while they may have family and ethnic backgrounds south of the border, very much participate in US civic life and have US citizenship. So when we're talking about Asian Pacific American popular culture and US Latino popular culture, we are thinking about this difference between race, ethnicity, and nationality that becomes really important for this unique set of cultures that happens that may not be authentically south of the border or east of the Pacific, but is a people's culture nonetheless. All right, so I'll leave it at there.